The autumn of 1891 brought with it a chill that seemed to settle not just in the air, but in the very bones of those who dared to venture into the remote valleys of western Massachusetts. It was here where ancient oaks twisted their gnarled branches toward a perpetually gray sky that Hollow Creek Seminary rose from the earth like a monument to forgotten prayers. The building itself defied easy description. Its stones, quarried from some distant mountain, bore a dark patina that made them appear almost black in certain light. Gothic spires pierced the low-hanging clouds, while narrow windows stared down like hollow eyes upon the winding road that led to its iron gates. The seminary promised to shape the next generation of scholars and clergy, yet something in its architecture suggested it had been built for a purpose far older than education. Clara Whitmore stepped from the horse-drawn carriage that had brought her from the train station, her small leather satchel clutched tightly in her gloved hands. At 17, she possessed the kind of earnest hope that could only belong to the young, a belief that truth could be found in faith, that questions had answers, and that God spoke to those who listened with pure hearts. Her father had died the previous winter, leaving her with little more than a burning desire to understand the divine mysteries that had claimed him. The other students arriving that day presented a curious mixture of the eager and the reluctant. Some came clutching letters of acceptance like sacred texts, while others bore the sullen expression of those who had been sent rather than chosen. Among the latter was Thomas Hale, a lean boy of 18 whose calloused hands spoke of long days behind a plow. His family had scraped together every penny to send him here, convinced that the clergy offered the only escape from the grinding poverty of their small farm. Reverend Nathaniel Carow emerged from the seminary's main entrance as the last carriage departed, leaving 23 new students standing in the courtyard like lost sheep. The headmaster was a tall, gaunt figure whose black robe seemed to absorb what little light filtered through the perpetual mist. His face bore the sharp angles of a man who had learned to find sustenance in denial, and his pale eyes held the kind of intensity that made students instinctively lower their gaze. "Welcome," Carow said, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard, despite its soft tone, to Hollow Creek Seminary. "You have come here seeking knowledge, seeking purpose, seeking God. What you will find is that these three things are not separate pursuits, but facets of a single sacred truth." He paused, allowing his words to settle over the assembled students like dust on ancient books. "Here, you will learn that obedience is the first virtue, sacrifice the second, and silence the third. Question nothing, surrender everything, and speak only when spoken to. These are not mere rules, they are commandments that will shape your souls." Clara felt a small shiver of unease at these words, though she could not say exactly why. There was something in Carow's tone, a fervor that seemed to burn too bright, like a candle flame that consumed its wick too quickly. The students were led through corridors lined with portraits of previous headmasters, their painted eyes seeming to track each footstep. The classrooms they glimpsed held not the warm wood and leather of traditional learning, but cold stone and iron, as if the builders had confused a school with a monastery, or perhaps something darker still. Their dormitories were sparse affairs, narrow beds, simple wooden desks, and windows that looked out upon the mist-shrouded valley below. Clara found herself assigned to a small room with 3 other girls, each as nervous and uncertain as herself. As they unpacked their few possessions in silence, she noticed that the previous occupants had left marks in the wooden walls, scratches that formed strange patterns, as if someone had been trying to communicate through symbols rather than words. The first evening meal was served in a vast hall where long tables stretched beneath vaulted ceilings lost in shadow. The food was simple fare: bread, thin soup, and water. As they ate, Carow delivered what he called their first lesson. "Hunger," he announced from the raised platform at the front of the hall, "is not your enemy. It is your teacher. When the body wants, the spirit learns to seek satisfaction elsewhere. When comfort is denied, the soul discovers strength." Clara noticed that some of the older students, those who had been at the seminary for a year or more, ate with mechanical precision, as if the act of nourishment had become a ritual rather than a pleasure. Their faces bore a peculiar pallor, and their eyes seemed to focus on nothing, staring into middle distances that held secrets she could not guess. That night, as Clara lay in her narrow bed listening to the whispered prayers of her roommates, she reflected on the day's strange impressions. The classes they had been shown mixed familiar scripture with texts she did not recognize, written in languages that seemed to twist on the page. The evening prayers had felt less like conversations with the divine and more like summoning. Even now she could not shake the feeling that their words had been directed not upward toward heaven, but downward into the very foundations of the ancient building. The local townsfolk who had delivered supplies that afternoon had maintained careful distances from the seminary grounds. One old woman, her cart loaded with preserved meat and root vegetables, had caught Clara's eye and whispered a warning. "The soil here is restless, child. It remembers things that should stay buried." But when Clara had asked what she meant, the woman had simply shaken her head and hurried away, making the sign of the cross with trembling fingers. As midnight approached, Clara found herself still awake, staring at the ceiling where shadows danced in patterns that seemed almost purposeful. It was then that she heard it, the deep, resonant toll of the seminary bell. The sound rolled across the valley like thunder, seeming to originate not from the tower she had seen that afternoon but from somewhere much deeper, much older. She sat up, expecting to hear movement from the other beds, perhaps questions about the late hour or complaints about the disturbance. Instead, she found her roommates sleeping peacefully, their breathing unchanged, as if the bell had never sounded at all. Clara slipped from her bed and moved to the window, pressing her face against the cold glass. The courtyard below lay empty, bathed in moonlight that seemed too bright, too cold. As she watched, she could have sworn she saw figures moving in the mist, not walking but gliding, as if their feet never quite touched the ground. The bell tolled again, and this time she counted the strikes. 12. Midnight exactly. Yet when she looked toward the bell tower, she could see no movement in its dark aperture, no silhouette of someone pulling the rope. It was then that a terrible thought crept into her mind, one that would haunt her through all the dark days to come. What if the warnings of the townsfolk were not mere superstition? What if the soil beneath Hollow Creek Seminary truly was restless? And what if the bell tolled not to mark the hours of the living, but to count something else entirely, something that dwelt in the spaces between prayers, in the silence between words, in the darkness between heartbeats? As Clara finally returned to her bed, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin, she could not escape one final haunting question that seemed to whisper itself directly into her soul. What happens to a place when too many prayers go unanswered, when too much faith dies in darkness, when too much hope is buried beneath stones that remember every scream? Dawn came gray and cheerless to Hollow Creek Seminary, filtered through windows that seemed to drain the light of all warmth before allowing it passage. Clara woke to the sound of a handbell being rung in the corridors, its harsh clatter a jarring contrast to the mysterious tolling she had heard at midnight. Around her, the other students moved with the mechanical precision of those who had learned that tardiness brought consequences best avoided. The morning meal consisted of watery porridge and stale bread, portions so meager that Clara's stomach continued to growl long after the bowls were cleared. She noticed that complaints about the food were met, not with explanation or apology, but with a reduction in the evening meal for the offending student. It was a lesson learned quickly and never forgotten. Want was not merely accepted here, it was cultivated. Reverend Caro presided over breakfast from his elevated table, observing his charges with the calculating gaze of a naturalist studying insects. When one boy, a round-faced youth, named Peter Mills, dared to ask for a second helping, Caro's voice cut through the hall like a blade. "Brother Mills," he said, his tone carrying a cold amusement. Do you believe that Christ fed his hunger before tending to the spiritual needs of the multitudes? Do you think the martyrs paused to request additional bread before facing the lions? The boy's face flushed crimson as every eye in the hall turned toward him. No, Reverend Caro, he whispered. Then perhaps you would benefit from a day of contemplation on the virtue of restraint. You will take no food until tomorrow's dawn and spend your evening hours in the chapel, considering how physical comfort can corrupt spiritual progress. Peter's shoulders sagged, but he nodded obediently. Clara watched this exchange with growing unease, recognizing in it the first glimpse of the seminary's true nature, a place where hunger was weapon, where humiliation was pedagogy, where the breaking of will was confused with the building of character. The academic schedule proved equally unsettling. Their first class, labeled Sacred Literature, was conducted in a windowless chamber deep within the building's interior. The instructor, a pale man called Brother Augustine, guided them through passages that Clara had never encountered in her father's Bible. These texts spoke of sacrifice in terms that made her skin crawl, not the metaphorical surrender of sin, but detailed descriptions of what the faithful owed to powers that dwelt beneath the earth. The divine, Brother Augustine intoned, his voice barely above a whisper, does not always manifest as light. Sometimes it appears as absence, as hunger, as the space between thoughts. To serve such divinity requires a different kind of devotion, one that empties rather than fills, that diminishes rather than enlarges. When Clara raised her hand to ask about the source of these unusual passages, Brother Augustine's pale eyes fixed upon her with unsettling intensity. Questions, Miss Whitmore, are luxuries afforded only to those who have first mastered obedience. Perhaps you would benefit from additional study. That afternoon, while her fellow students attended their regular lessons, Clara found herself assigned to what was euphemistically called contemplative labor, scrubbing the stone floors of the lower corridors with a brush so worn that it accomplished little beyond the abrading of her knuckles. It was here, kneeling in the perpetual twilight of the seminary's depths, that she first encountered Thomas Hale. The farm boy had been assigned similar punishment for the crime of falling asleep during morning prayers, and as they worked side by side in enforced silence, Clara began to recognize a kindred spirit. Where other students seemed to accept their circumstances with resignation or even gratitude, Thomas maintained a spark of quiet defiance that reminded her of her own growing doubts. It was during this shared labor that they began to notice the patterns that would haunt them both. Students who questioned Caro's teachings too openly had a habit of disappearing. First there was Sarah Delacroix, a sharp-minded girl who had dared to cite traditional biblical passages that contradicted Brother Augustine's lessons. She missed evening prayers one night, and by morning her bed had been stripped, her possessions removed, and her name erased from the attendance rolls, as if she had never existed. When Thomas quietly inquired about Sarah's whereabouts, he was told she had been transferred to a more suitable institution, yet no carriage had been seen leaving the seminary grounds, and no letters of explanation were ever sent to worried families. Sarah had simply vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of lavender soap that had once marked her presence. Others followed. Marcus Webb, who had questioned the seminary's peculiar dietary restrictions, Elizabeth Hardy, who had refused to participate in certain evening rituals that seemed more pagan than Christian, James Crawford, who had been caught attempting to leave the grounds without permission. One by one, they disappeared into the same administrative void that had claimed Sarah, their absence explained with increasingly threadbare excuses about transfers and family emergencies. Yet even more disturbing than these disappearances were the students who remained. Those who submitted completely to Caro's regime underwent changes that were subtle but unmistakable. Their skin took on a waxy pallor, as if something vital was being slowly drained from their bodies. They moved with an odd, synchronized rhythm during group activities, as if responding to music only they could hear. Most unsettling of all, they spoke in voices that seemed to belong to someone else, inflections and phrases that felt borrowed, worn like ill-fitting clothes. During their third week at the seminary, Clara discovered something that made her blood run cold. While cleaning the chapel as part of another contemplative assignment, she noticed marks carved into the wooden pews, the same strange symbols she had glimpsed in her dormitory room, but here they were everywhere, etched into every surface with obsessive repetition. The symbols consisted of circles intersected by lines, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed slightly outside normal perception. Some were fresh, the wood still bearing the pale scars of recent carving. Others had been darkened by age, and what looked suspiciously like dried blood. As Clara traced one of the symbols with her finger, she felt a sudden wave of nausea wash over her, accompanied by the distant sound of voices speaking in languages she did not recognize. The sensation lasted only moments, but it left her with the unshakable conviction that these marks were not mere decoration or vandalism. They were a form of communication, messages left by those who could no longer speak for themselves. That evening, as she lay in bed listening to the rhythmic breathing of her roommates, Clara reflected on the growing certainty that Hollow Creek Seminary was not what it appeared to be. The hunger, the disappearances, the strange rituals disguised as prayer, all of it pointed to something far more sinister than mere religious education. Yet what frightened her most was not the mystery itself, but her own growing hunger for answers. Despite the danger, despite the warnings whispered by empty beds and carved into wooden pews, she found herself drawn deeper into the seminary's secrets. It was as if the building itself was teaching her its most important lesson, that some hunger, once awakened, could never be satisfied by ordinary food. As midnight approached, and the familiar toll of the invisible bell began to sound across the valley, Clara made a decision that would determine the course of all her remaining days at Hollow Creek. She would find the truth behind the symbols, behind the disappearances, behind the voices that spoke through borrowed throats. Even if that truth proved more terrible than ignorance, even if seeking it meant joining the ranks of those who had vanished into administrative silence, she would not stop asking questions. After all, what was faith without doubt to define it? What was the truth without lies to reveal it? And what was a soul without the courage to risk its own salvation in pursuit of something greater than comfortable ignorance? The announcement came during morning assembly on a Tuesday that felt heavy with unspoken dread. Reverend Caro stood before the assembled students, his gaunt frame casting long shadows in the pale light that filtered through the chapel's ancient windows. Behind him, the wooden crucifix seemed to lean forward, as if straining to hear the words that would soon echo through the vaulted chamber. "Tomorrow," Caro declared, his voice carrying the weight of sacred pronouncement, "we shall observe the night of silence. For 24 hours, no word shall pass your lips. In this sacred quiet, you will learn to hear what cannot be spoken, to understand what cannot be taught, to commune with truths that exist beyond the crude instrument of human language." Clara felt a chill settle between her shoulder blades as she watched her fellow students receive this news. Some nodded with the eager compliance that had become their trademark, while others, primarily the newer arrivals, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But it was the older students who truly caught her attention. Their faces had gone blank, not with confusion or fear, but with a kind of hollow recognition, as if they had heard this announcement many times before. The night of silence began at sunset the following day. As darkness settled over Hollow Creek Seminary, like a suffocating blanket, the students gathered in the chapel for what Caro called the opening meditation. The space felt different in the dying light, larger somehow, as if the shadows were expanding the walls beyond their normal boundaries. Brother Augustine led them in a series of wordless prayers, gestures, and postures that seemed more ancient than Christian. Clara found herself mimicking the movements of those around her, but with each gesture, she felt as though she were participating in something that predated not just the seminary, but perhaps Christianity itself. It was during this ceremony that she first noticed the choir. They stood in the raised gallery at the back of the chapel, perhaps 20 students who had been at Hollow Creek for 2 years or more. In the growing darkness, their pale faces seemed to float like disembodied spirits, and their lips moved in perfect unison, forming words that produced no sound. Yet Clara could feel their silent song, a vibration that seemed to originate not from their throats, but from the stones beneath her feet. As the hours passed and true darkness claimed the seminary, Clara began to understand that the night of silence was not about the absence of sound, but about learning to hear different kinds of communication. Footsteps in the corridors carried messages she was only beginning to decipher. The settling of ancient timbers spoke in a language of creaks and sighs. Even her own heartbeat seemed to tap out rhythms that matched patterns she had seen carved into the chapel pews. Unable to sleep, Clara slipped from her bed near midnight and made her way to the window. The courtyard below lay shrouded in mist that moved with too much purpose, swirling in patterns that reminded her of the symbols etched throughout the building. As she watched, she became aware of movement in the fog, figures that seemed to drift rather than walk, their forms wavering at the edges as if they were not quite solid. The weight of unseen eyes settled upon her shoulders like a physical presence. She turned from the window to find her roommate, Margaret, standing in the center of their small chamber. The girl's face was turned upward, her eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible, and from her throat came a sound that made Clara's skin crawl, a low humming that seemed to emerge not from Margaret's vocal cords, but from somewhere much deeper. The melody was unlike anything Clara had heard in her 17 years of life. It was beautiful and terrible, ancient and alien, carrying within its wordless notes a sadness so profound that tears began to stream down Clara's cheeks without her conscious awareness. Yet beneath the sorrow lay something else, a hunger so vast and patient that it made her stomach clench with primal fear. Margaret continued to hum for what felt like hours, her unseeing eyes fixed upon some point beyond the ceiling, beyond the night, beyond the world itself. When the sound finally faded, the girl simply returned to her bed and lay down as if nothing had occurred, her breathing settling into the deep rhythms of natural sleep. But Clara knew that what she had witnessed was anything but natural. The next morning, determined to find answers, she approached Thomas during their brief breakfast. Communication without words proved easier than expected. A few meaningful glances, some careful gestures, and they had arranged to meet in the library during the afternoon study period. The library occupied a wing of the seminary that felt older than the rest, its shelves lined with volumes that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the weak light from the windows. Most of the books were familiar theological texts, but tucked away in the darker corners were works that had no business in a Christian institution. Working in careful silence, Clara and Thomas began to search for any record that might explain the seminary's true history. It was Thomas who discovered the ledger, hidden behind a row of seemingly identical prayer books. The leather binding bore no title, but inside, written in a careful hand, were entries that made Clara's blood run cold. The ledger belonged to Reverend Josiah Blackwood, headmaster of Hollow Creek Seminary from 1831 to 1847. His entries began with conventional academic concerns, enrollment numbers, curriculum planning, correspondence with church authorities. But as the years progressed, the tone shifted dramatically. The Covenant of 62 grows stronger, read one entry from 1845. 3 more have joined the silent choir this season, their voices added to the endless song that feeds our master below. Soon the number will be complete, and the awakening can begin. Clara's hands trembled as she turned the pages, each entry more disturbing than the last. Blackwood wrote of students who graduated to silence, of rituals conducted in chambers beneath the chapel, of a presence that dwelt in the foundations of the building and demanded constant nourishment in the form of young souls. The final entry was dated March 15, 1847. The 62nd offering approaches. I have chosen young William Marsh, whose voice carries the purest note of despair. Tonight, beneath the altar, he will complete the covenant and join his brothers and sisters in eternal service. The master grows impatient for. The entry ended mid-sentence, the pen scratching across the page as if Blackwood's hand had been suddenly paralyzed or worse. The remaining pages were blank, but Clara noticed that several had been torn out, leaving only ragged edges as evidence of whatever final horrors might have been recorded there. As they absorbed this terrible information, Thomas pointed to something that made Clara's heart skip a beat. According to the ledger, Hollow Creek Seminary had been founded in 1831, not 1891, as they had been told, which meant the school had existed for 60 years before their arrival, operating in secret, accumulating its quota of silent voices one by one. That night, as the official end of the night of silence approached, Clara lay awake listening to the sounds that filled the darkness. The midnight bell tolled as always, but this time she could hear something else beneath its resonant voice, a chorus of whispers that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the building. The whispers spoke in voices that sounded like children, though the words they formed belonged to no earthly language. Yet somehow, Clara understood their meaning. They were calling to her, welcoming her, promising that soon she would join their eternal song. They spoke of the beauty of surrender, the peace of silence, the joy of feeding something greater than themselves. As the bell completed its 12th toll, the whispers faded, but their message remained burned into Clara's memory. She now understood what Margaret's midnight humming truly was, not a symptom of illness or madness, but a rehearsal. The girl was practicing for her own graduation to silence, learning the melody she would sing forever in the darkness beneath Hollow Creek Seminary. And with that understanding came a terrible certainty. The night of silence was not a single event but a test. Those who heard the whispers, who felt the pull of the endless song, who demonstrated their readiness to join the silent choir, they would be chosen for the honor of completing the Covenant of 62. Clara pulled her thin blanket closer around her shoulders and tried to forget the beauty of the melody Margaret had hummed. But already she could feel it taking root in her memory, its haunting notes beginning to echo in the spaces between her thoughts. The question was no longer whether she would be chosen, but how long she could resist the growing urge to hum along. October brought with it a peculiar sickness that crept through Hollow Creek Seminary like fog through a graveyard. It was not the familiar ailments of autumn, no coughing or fever, no complaints of aches or chills. Instead, the students began to wither from within, as if some essential part of themselves was slowly being consumed. Clara first noticed it during morning prayers, when she observed that several of her fellow students had developed a translucent quality to their skin. In certain light she could almost see through them, as if they were becoming transparent, fading gradually from the world of the living into something else entirely. The affected students moved differently too, their gestures taking on an odd, synchronized quality during group activities. When they walked, their footsteps fell in perfect rhythm. When they turned pages during lessons, the sound was like a single sheet of paper being moved by an invisible hand. Most disturbing of all, when they spoke, which they did less and less frequently, their voices carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in frequencies just beyond normal hearing. Timothy Ashford was among the first to succumb completely. A thin boy from Vermont, who had arrived with Clara's group, he had always been quiet and studious. But as the weeks passed, his silence deepened into something that felt less like introversion and more like absence. During meals, he would stare at his meager portion without eating, as if he had forgotten the purpose of food entirely. The morning Timothy collapsed during Reverend Caro's sermon was the morning Clara truly understood the nature of their situation. The boy simply crumpled to the stone floor of the chapel, his body folding in on itself like a discarded puppet. Yet instead of rushing to his aid or calling for medical assistance, Caro merely stepped over the prone figure and continued his discourse as if nothing had occurred. "The flesh," the headmaster intoned, his voice never wavering despite Timothy's labored breathing echoing through the chamber, "is merely the vessel through which the spirit learns its most important lessons. When that vessel has served its purpose, when every drop of earthly attachment has been drained away, only then can the soul achieve its true destiny. Clara watched in horrified fascination as Timothy's chest rose and fell with increasing irregularity, his breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. Other students sat motionless in their pews, their eyes fixed upon Caro, as if the dying boy at his feet was invisible to them. Only Thomas showed any sign of distress, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists as he struggled against the urge to intervene. By that evening, Timothy had vanished. His bed in the dormitory was stripped bare, his few possessions removed, and his name erased from the attendance rolls with the same administrative efficiency that had claimed all the others. When newer students dared to ask about his whereabouts, they were told he had been transferred due to health concerns, but no carriage had been seen departing the seminary grounds. More troubling still were the students who remained but who bore increasingly obvious signs of the withering. Margaret, Clara's roommate, had developed a habit of standing at their window for hours each night, her lips moving silently as if in conversation with something only she could see. Her reflection in the glass had begun to lag behind her movements, creating a disturbing double image that made Clara's eyes water to observe. Brother Augustine seemed not only aware of these changes but actively encouraging them. During their increasingly bizarre theology lessons, he spoke approvingly of students who demonstrated what he called spiritual refinement, the gradual abandonment of earthly concerns in favor of higher mysteries. The process, he explained to his hollow-eyed pupils, requires patience and dedication. The soul must be emptied before it can be filled with divine purpose. The self must be diminished before it can be expanded beyond mortal limitations. What you perceive as loss is actually the greatest gift, the opportunity to serve something infinitely greater than your own small existence. Outside the seminary's walls, the local townsfolk had begun to avoid the hilltop entirely. Clara observed this during one of her rare glimpses of the outside world from the chapel windows. The road that led to the seminary gates, once traveled by merchants and mail carriers, now lay empty except for occasional bundles of supplies left at the base of the hill, like offerings to appease some hungry god. The village of Hollow Creek itself seemed to have developed a collective amnesia regarding the seminary's existence. When questioned by desperate parents searching for their missing children, the townspeople would shake their heads in genuine confusion, insisting that no such institution existed in their valley. It was as if the school existed in a pocket of reality separate from the normal world, visible only to those already trapped within its influence. The storm that struck in late October brought with it sounds that had nothing to do with wind or rain. As lightning split the darkness and thunder shook the ancient stones of the seminary, Clara heard other voices carried in the howling air, dozens of them, crying out in languages both familiar and alien. Some sounded like children pleading for help, while others sang lullabies in tones that made her teeth ache with sympathetic vibration. It was during this tempest that Clara made a discovery that would haunt her for the remainder of her time at Hollow Creek. Unable to sleep due to the cacophony outside her window, she had taken to sketching in her diary, an attempt to record the strange symbols she had observed throughout the building. As her pencil traced the familiar pattern of circles intersected by lines, something extraordinary occurred. The symbol began to move on the page, its lines shifting and reforming, as if alive. More disturbing still, Clara found that she understood its meaning with perfect clarity, as if the mark was communicating directly with some part of her mind that existed beyond conscious thought. The symbol spoke of hunger, not for food or comfort, but for essence itself. It told of a presence that dwelt beneath the earth, patient and eternal, sustained by the gradual consumption of human souls. It revealed that the seminary was not a school at all, but a feeding ground, carefully designed to ripen its students like fruit on a vine before harvesting their spiritual energy for some unthinkable purpose. That night, Clara dreamed of 62 figures standing in perfect formation within the chapel. Their faces were shrouded in shadow, but their voices rose in a harmonious chorus, singing the same wordless melody that Margaret hummed at her midnight vigil. As the dream progressed, Clara realized that the figures were not singing to worship some distant deity, but to feed something that lurked directly beneath their feet. The dream chapel began to crack and crumble, revealing layer upon layer of older structures built into the hillside like geological strata. At the deepest level, in a chamber carved from living rock, something vast and patient waited in darkness. It had no form that human minds could comprehend, existing instead as pure hunger given consciousness, an emptiness so profound that it created its own gravity, drawing everything toward its endless maw. In the dream, the 62 figures began to repeat Clara's symbol, painting it in blood upon the ancient walls, while their voices grew louder and more urgent. She understood that they were preparing for something, marking the boundaries of a ritual that had been decades in the making. The ceremony would require one final participant, one last voice to complete the choir that would sing their master fully into the world. Clara woke to find her own hand moving across the page of her diary, sketching the symbol over and over again in lines that grew darker and more precise with each repetition. Around her, her roommates slept the sleep of the withering, their breathing so shallow that it barely stirred the air. Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, but the voices on the wind continued their lament. And somewhere in the depths of the building, Clara could swear she heard the sound of stone grinding against stone, as if ancient mechanisms long dormant were beginning to stir to life. The withering was not a disease, she realized with crystalline clarity. It was preparation. The students were not dying but transforming, becoming something that could exist in the space between life and death, between sound and silence, between prayer and hunger. And with each passing day, Clara could feel the same transformation beginning within herself, a gradual emptying that felt both terrifying and strangely liberating, as if she were finally approaching the answers she had sought since that first midnight bell had tolled across the valley. November descended upon Hollow Creek Seminary with the finality of a coffin lid closing. The mist that perpetually shrouded the valley had thickened into something almost solid, pressing against the windows like grasping fingers and muffling all sound from the world beyond. Within the ancient walls, the atmosphere grew dense with anticipation, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Reverend Caro's announcement came during what he called a special convocation, an assembly where all remaining students were summoned to the chapel, regardless of their usual schedules. Clara noticed immediately that their numbers had dwindled significantly since her arrival. Of the 23 students who had entered the seminary that autumn, fewer than 15 remained. The others had vanished into the same administrative void that had claimed Timothy and Sarah, and all the rest, leaving behind only empty beds and erased memories. Those who remained bore the unmistakable marks of the withering. Their skin had taken on the translucent quality Clara had first observed weeks earlier, but now it seemed to glow faintly in the chapel's dim light, as if lit from within by some phosphorescent decay. Their movements had become increasingly synchronized, creating the disturbing impression of a single consciousness wearing multiple bodies. "My children," Caro began, his voice carrying easily through the vaulted space despite its conversational tone, "you have learned much during your time at Hollow Creek. You have discovered the virtue of hunger, the wisdom of silence, the beauty of surrender. Tonight, you will learn the greatest lesson of all, the truth of sacrifice." He paused, allowing his pale eyes to sweep across the assembled students like a predator selecting prey from a herd. Sacrifice is not merely the surrender of material possessions or earthly comforts. True sacrifice requires the giving of oneself, completely and irrevocably, to serve a purpose greater than individual existence. Clara felt Thomas shift beside her, his body radiating a tension that matched her own growing dread. Around them, the other students listened with expressions of rapt attention, as if Caro's words were music to their withering souls. "Tonight," the headmaster continued, "one among you will have the privilege of demonstrating ultimate devotion. One will be chosen to show us all what it means to surrender, not just possessions or comfort, but life itself in service to the sacred mysteries we guard within these walls. The selection process was conducted with the solemnity of a religious ceremony. Brother Augustine moved through the assembled students carrying a simple wooden bowl filled with what appeared to be folded papers. Each student was instructed to reach into the bowl and withdraw a single slip without looking, their fate determined by whatever message they might find written there. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as the bowl approached her position in the third row. When her turn came, she reached into the vessel with fingers that trembled despite her efforts to maintain composure. The paper she withdrew was blank, as were those selected by Thomas and most of the other students. But when young David Marsh, a pale, nervous boy who had arrived only weeks after Clara, unfolded his slip, he found a single word written in what looked like dried blood: chosen. The transformation that came over David was immediate and absolute. The fear that had been his constant companion since arriving at Hollow Creek drained from his face, replaced by an expression of beatific calm. His eyes, which had darted nervously about the chapel only moments before, now fixed upon Caro with the unwavering devotion of a saint gazing upon divine revelation. "I am honored," David said, his voice carrying a resonance that seemed to emerge from somewhere deeper than his throat. "I accept this blessing with gratitude and joy." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Clara had ever witnessed or imagined. David was led to the front of the chapel, where Brother Augustine began to dress him in robes of deep crimson while chanting in a language that predated Latin by millennia. The other students joined their voices to the chant, creating harmonies that made the air itself seem to vibrate with otherworldly energy. As the ritual progressed, Clara began to understand that what she was witnessing was not martyrdom in any conventional Christian sense. This was something far older, far more primal, a feeding ceremony designed to nourish whatever presence lurked beneath the seminary's foundations. David was not dying for his faith. He was being prepared as an offering to something that had never known the light of heaven. The procession moved from the chapel toward a section of the building Clara had never seen before. Hidden behind what appeared to be a solid wall was a narrow staircase that descended into the earth, its stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use. The air that rose from these depths carried with it scents that had no business in any place touched by human habitation, the smell of earth that had never known sunlight, of water that had never felt rain, of things that grew in darkness and fed on despair. Clara and Thomas found themselves swept along with the procession, unable to break free without drawing attention they could not afford. As they descended deeper into the hillside, the walls around them changed from worked stone to living rock, carved with the same symbols Clara had been sketching in her diary, but infinitely older and more complex. The chamber at the bottom of the stairs defied description in conventional terms. It was vast yet intimate, ancient yet somehow alive, empty yet filled with a presence so overwhelming that breathing became an act of conscious will. At its center stood an altar carved from a single block of black stone, its surface stained with substances that Clara preferred not to contemplate. It was here that the true horror revealed itself. As David approached the altar with steps that never faltered, Clara saw them, the 61 others who had preceded him. They stood in perfect formation around the chamber's perimeter, their bodies somehow preserved yet transformed, their faces bearing expressions of eternal devotion to the thing that dwelt in the darkness beyond mortal perception. The 61 sang as David took his place upon the altar, their voices creating harmonies that seemed to originate not from their throats, but from the stone itself. Brother Augustine raised a blade that caught no reflection from the torchlight, its metal black as midnight and sharp as winter wind. David's eyes remained fixed upon some point beyond the visible world as the blade descended, his lips forming words of gratitude, even as his life flowed away to feed the hungry darkness below. But death, Clara realized with dawning horror, was not the end of David's service. Even as his mortal form grew still upon the altar, something else began to stir within the chamber. The air grew thick with presence, and David's voice joined the eternal chorus, his spirit bound forever to serve the thing that had accepted his sacrifice. As the ceremony concluded, and the procession began to file back toward the surface, Clara caught sight of something that made her blood freeze. Carved into the altar's base was a series of names, 61 in total, representing all those who had been chosen over the decades of the seminary's operation. But there was space for one more, and as she watched, invisible hands began to etch letters into the stone. Her own name appeared in the ancient rock, as if written by phantom fingers: Clara Whitmore. The message was unmistakable. She had been selected not randomly but deliberately, chosen from the moment she had first set foot within Hollow Creek's walls. The bell that rang at midnight was not marking the hours but counting down toward her own appointment with the altar, her own graduation to the eternal choir that sang in darkness below. As they emerged from the depths and returned to the world of dormitories and classrooms, Clara felt the weight of this knowledge settle upon her shoulders like a funeral shroud. Around her, the other students moved with the mechanical precision of those who had witnessed something beyond human comprehension, their faces blank with the kind of peace that comes only to those who have surrendered all hope of escape. The ceremony was complete, but the true horror was just beginning. Somewhere in the depths below, 62 voices now sang their wordless song, preparing the way for something that had waited in darkness for longer than human memory could reach. And Clara knew, with the terrible certainty of the condemned, that her own voice would soon join that infernal chorus, adding its notes to a melody that would continue long after the last star had burned out in the cold darkness of space. The days following David Marsh's sacrifice took on a dreamlike quality that made Clara question the very nature of reality itself. The other students moved through their daily routines with mechanical precision, but their eyes held the vacant stare of sleepwalkers navigating a world that existed only in dreams. Conversations became increasingly rare, replaced by a form of silent communication that seemed to flow directly from mind to mind, without the crude intervention of spoken words. It was during this period of mounting unreality that Clara and Thomas made their most significant discovery. Driven by desperation and the growing certainty that conventional escape was impossible, they had begun to explore sections of the seminary that were supposedly off-limits to students. It was in one of these forgotten wings that they found the library that was not supposed to exist. Unlike the sterile collection of approved texts in the main building, this hidden repository contained volumes that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. The books here were bound in materials that Clara preferred not to examine too closely, their pages filled with diagrams and texts that hurt to look at directly. Many were written in languages that predated human civilization, their symbols shifting and reforming whenever observed peripherally. Among these blasphemous texts, Thomas discovered a collection that would haunt them both for the remainder of their time at Hollow Creek. These books detailed what their anonymous authors called the Hollow Doctrine, a theological system that inverted every principle of traditional Christianity into something that served entities dwelling in the spaces between reality. According to these texts, the being that dwelt beneath the seminary was not a demon or fallen angel, but something far more ancient and alien. The authors called it the Hollow God, a presence that existed as pure negation, not evil in any human sense, but rather the absence of all qualities that humans considered good, true, or beautiful. It fed not on flesh or blood, but on the gradual consumption of human essence itself, drawing sustenance from the slow dissolution of everything that made a person individual and alive. The doctrine explained that traditional worship prayers directed upward toward heaven actually weakened the barriers between dimensions, creating channels through which the hollow God could extend its influence into the mortal world. The seminary existed as a kind of spiritual amplifier, concentrating the faith and devotion of its students into a beacon that called across the void to things that should remain forever hidden. As Clara read these revelations by flickering candlelight, she began to understand the true purpose of their education at Hollow Creek. They were not being trained as ministers or scholars, but as spiritual batteries, their faith carefully cultivated and refined until it could serve as fuel for rituals beyond human comprehension. The hunger they experienced, the isolation, the gradual erosion of their individual personalities, all of it was designed to prepare them for eventual consumption by something that existed in the spaces between thoughts, between heartbeats, between the moments when consciousness flickered and left the soul vulnerable to invasion. The most disturbing text they discovered was titled The Final Covenant, written in what appeared to be multiple hands over the course of many years. This document detailed the ultimate goal of the Hollow Doctrine, the summoning of the Hollow God into full manifestation within the physical world. Such an event would require the voluntary sacrifice of 62 souls, their combined essence creating a bridge strong enough to support the passage of something that had never known material existence. The text made it clear that the number was not arbitrary. 62 represented some fundamental principle in the mathematics of interdimensional travel, a frequency that would create resonance between the world of the living and the realm of pure negation. Each sacrifice had to be freely given, which explained the elaborate psychological conditioning that preceded every selection. The victims had to believe, with absolute conviction, that their death served a higher purpose. Anything less than complete willing surrender would contaminate the ritual and require the process to begin again. It was while studying these horrific revelations that Clara and Thomas encountered Sister Miriam, one of the few faculty members who had shown them any kindness during their time at the seminary. They discovered her in the hidden library's deepest chamber, weeping over a journal filled with names, hundreds of them, representing students who had vanished over the decades since the seminary's true founding. Sister Miriam's presence in the forbidden archive was itself a revelation. Unlike Brother Augustine and the other faculty members, she had retained enough of her humanity to feel horror at what Hollow Creek had become. She had been a student herself decades earlier, but had been selected for a different kind of service to remain behind as a caretaker and witness, helping to maintain the facade of normalcy that allowed the seminary to continue its grim work. "I tried to leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the oppressive silence of the chamber. "Many times I tried to walk away, to find help, to warn the authorities, but the boundaries are stronger than mere stone and iron. Once you've been marked by this place, once you've participated in its rituals, you become part of it forever." She showed them a torn page from a manuscript that had been hidden within the binding of another book, a fragment that revealed the ultimate commandment of the Hollow Doctrine: memory must be consumed so the faithful may endure. This principle explained why the disappeared students were not merely killed, but somehow incorporated into the seminary's spiritual structure, their individual identities dissolved and repurposed to serve the collective needs of the institution. That night, as Clara lay in her narrow bed listening to Margaret's increasingly frequent midnight conversations with invisible presences, she experienced something that shattered her remaining illusions about the nature of reality itself. When she looked toward the window to check the source of a strange light that had begun to flicker outside, she saw Thomas's reflection staring back at her from the glass. But Thomas was not in her room. He was 3 floors below in the male dormitory, supposedly asleep in his own bed. Yet there he was in the window, his lips moving soundlessly, as if trying to communicate some urgent message. His reflection remained even after Clara moved away from the glass, maintaining its own independent existence that followed different rules than the physical world. The distortion of reality was accelerating. Clara realized with growing horror. The boundaries between the living and the consumed were beginning to blur, creating overlaps and echoes that allowed the disappeared students to bleed through into the world of the survivors. She was beginning to see them everywhere, in mirrors, in shadows, in the corner of her vision where movement flickered just beyond the reach of conscious perception. The seminary was preparing for something massive, some final convergence that would require all barriers between dimensions to collapse simultaneously. The 60-second sacrifice was not just the culmination of decades of preparation, but the key that would unlock doors that had remained sealed since the birth of the physical universe. As Clara finally drifted into uneasy sleep, she could feel the weight of invisible eyes upon her, studying her with the patient attention of a naturalist observing a specimen. Somewhere in the darkness below, 61 voices sang their eternal song, preparing harmonies that would soon welcome a new addition to their chorus. And in her dreams, Clara found herself standing before the black altar, while phantom hands carved her name deeper and deeper into stone that had never known the touch of sunlight. The buried doctrine was no longer hidden beneath layers of acceptable theology. It was surfacing, claiming the seminary and everyone within it, preparing for a revelation that would remake the world in the image of the hollow god's endless hunger. December brought with it a cold that seemed to emanate not from the winter air, but from the very foundations of Hollow Creek Seminary. The ancient stones radiated a chill that no fire could warm, as if the building itself was slowly dying from within. Ice formed in geometric patterns on the windows, not the random fractals of natural frost, but deliberate designs that resembled the symbols carved throughout the structure. The midnight bell, which had tolled faithfully since Clara's first night at the seminary, began to change. What had once been a simple 12-stroke announcement of the hour now extended into elaborate sequences that followed no earthly timekeeping. Some nights it would ring 13 times, or 17 or 23 prime numbers that seemed to correspond to calculations inscribed in the hidden texts Clara and Thomas had discovered. Clara had begun to keep count, marking each toll in her diary with growing dread. She realized that the bell was not announcing time at all, but tracking something far more sinister, the gradual consumption of souls within the seminary's walls. Each extended sequence marked another student's transition from the world of the living to the eternal choir that sang in the depths below. The pattern was becoming clear with terrifying precision. 61 tolls had been recorded over the decades since the seminary's founding, each one representing a life given to feed the hollow god's patient hunger. Now, as winter deepened its grip upon the valley, the bell's voice grew stronger and more urgent, as if anticipating the arrival of the 62nd and final sacrifice. Thomas had grown visibly weaker over the past weeks, his physical deterioration matching the spiritual withering that affected all the seminary students. But in his case, Clara observed changes that went beyond mere weakness. His shadow had begun to lag behind his movements, creating a disturbing double image that made tracking his position difficult. More troubling still, she sometimes caught glimpses of him in places where he could not physically be, standing in corridors while he sat beside her in class, walking through walls as if they were mere suggestions rather than solid barriers. "I dream of them," he confessed during one of their increasingly rare private conversations. "The 61. They call to me every night, showing me the peace they've found in surrender. They tell me how beautiful it is to become part of something greater than individual existence, to add my voice to their eternal song." Clara noticed that even as he spoke of resistance, Thomas's voice carried harmonics that matched those of the disappeared students. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. He was beginning to resonate with the frequencies that bound the consumed souls to their underground prison. Each night brought him closer to joining their ranks, and each morning revealed less of the farm boy she had befriended and more of something that belonged to the hollow god. Reverend Caro had begun to deliver what he called preparatory sermons, lectures that spoke openly of the approaching culmination of the seminary's true purpose. Gone was any pretense of conventional Christian education. Instead, he spoke of sacrifice as the highest form of worship, of dissolution as the path to enlightenment, of the honor that awaited those chosen to serve as bridges between dimensions. "The final lesson approaches," he announced during what would prove to be the last formal gathering of students in the chapel. "Soon the covenant will be complete, and the faithful will witness the birth of a new age. Those who have been selected for this honor should prepare themselves with joy, knowing that their names will be remembered in the songs that echo through eternity." The remaining students, now fewer than 10 in total, received this news with expressions of beatific calm that made Clara's skin crawl. They had moved beyond fear, beyond hope, beyond any emotion that marked them as truly human. They were vessels now, hollow shells waiting to be filled with purpose greater than their own small lives. It was during this period of mounting dread that Clara made a decision that would determine the course of her final days at Hollow Creek Seminary. She would descend into the crypt beneath the chapel, face whatever waited in those ancient chambers, and discover the full truth behind the mystery that had consumed so many lives. The decision came not from courage but from desperation. She could feel the same spiritual erosion affecting her that had claimed Thomas and all the others. Her reflection was beginning to show traces of the translucent quality that marked the consumed, and her dreams were filled with visions of herself standing among the 61, adding her voice to their wordless chorus. But there was another reason for her decision, one that she barely dared acknowledge even to herself. Part of her, a growing part, was beginning to find the idea of surrender appealing. The constant fear, the endless questions, the burden of maintaining individual consciousness in a place designed to dissolve such distinctions, all of it was becoming too much to bear. The promise of peace, of belonging, of purpose greater than personal survival, whispered to her with increasing seductiveness. She shared her intention with Thomas during what they both understood would be their final private conversation. His response revealed just how far his own transformation had progressed. "Why fight it?" he asked, his eyes reflecting depths that seemed to extend far beyond his physical form. "Why cling to the illusion of separate existence when you could become part of something eternal and beautiful? I've seen what waits below, Clara. It's not death, it's transcendence." That night, as the midnight bell began its count, and Clara prepared to make her descent into the seminary's buried heart, she reflected on the terrible irony of their situation. She had come to Hollow Creek seeking answers about faith and the divine, and she had found them, but the truth was more horrifying than ignorance could ever be. The bell told its extended sequence as Clara slipped from her bed and made her way through corridors that seemed to shift and flow around her like liquid darkness. 13 strokes, then 17, then 23 prime numbers that carved themselves into her consciousness with the weight of mathematical certainty. As the final toll faded into silence, Clara reached the chapel door and pressed her hand against its ancient wood. The barrier swung open at her touch, revealing the sacred space where so many had gathered for their final lesson in sacrifice. Moonlight streaming through the stained glass windows painted everything in shades of blood and bone, while shadows moved with purposeful intelligence in the corners where human eyes could not quite focus. The altar waited at the chapel's heart, its black stone surface bearing stains that told the story of 61 lives surrendered to feed something that should never have been awakened. And carved into its base, her name gleamed with fresh cuts that wept a substance too dark to be mere blood. Clara Whitmore, the inscription read, as if her fate had been determined before her birth, before the seminary's founding, before the first human had looked up at the stars and wondered what looked back. The 60-second toll was approaching, and with it would come the completion of a covenant that had been decades in the making. Whether she would stand with the consumed or find some way to break the pattern that had claimed so many lives remained to be seen. But as Clara approached the sealed door that led to the chambers below, she could already hear the voices of the 61 calling her name, welcoming her home to the darkness where all questions finally found their answers. The stone door that sealed the entrance to the crypt had been carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the uncertain light of Clara's stolen candle. As her fingers traced the ancient markings, she felt them respond to her touch like living things, the stone growing warm beneath her palm, as if recognizing something within her that she herself did not yet understand. Thomas appeared beside her, as if materializing from shadow itself, his physical form now so translucent that she could see the wall through his chest. yet his eyes retained enough of their human warmth to remind her of the boy who had once feared nothing more than disappointing his farming family. "The door opens only for those who have been chosen," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that belonged to the eternal choir below. "It recognizes the mark that was placed upon us from our first night here. We were never students, Clara. We were always offering." Together, they pressed against the ancient barrier, and it swung inward with surprising ease, revealing a staircase that descended into depths that predated human memory. The air that rose from below carried scents of earth and time, of things that had grown in darkness for millennia, of spaces where light had never penetrated and sound took on qualities that existed beyond normal perception. Each step down carried them further from the world of the living and deeper into realms where different laws governed existence itself. The walls around them were no longer worked stone but living rock, carved with symbols that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions, creating patterns so complex that following them with the eye induced a form of hypnosis that threatened to trap consciousness in endless geometric loops. Clara's candle flame began to burn with colors that had no names, casting light that revealed rather than illuminated, showing them truths that human minds were not designed to comprehend. In this spectral radiance, she could see the true age of the passages they traversed, not decades or centuries, but geological epochs, as if the crypt had been waiting in the earth since before continents had taken their current forms. The first chamber they entered contained what appeared to be a library, but one devoted to texts that should never have been written. Shelves carved directly from the living rock held volumes bound in materials that Clara recognized with sick fascination as human skin, their pages filled with diagrams and formulae that described the mathematics of dimensional breach. It was here that they found the complete history of Hollow Creek Seminary, recorded in a journal kept by every headmaster since the institution's founding. The entries revealed that each leader had been chosen not for theological expertise, but for their willingness to serve as conduits for the Hollow God's influence in the mortal world. Each had surrendered their humanity piece by piece, trading individual consciousness for the power to shape reality according to their master's hunger. But the journals revealed something even more disturbing. The seminary was not unique. Across the world, dozens of similar institutions operated in secret, each working to gather the 62 souls required for their own summoning rituals. The Hollow God was not a single entity, but rather a collective consciousness that existed in the spaces between realities, and it was awakening simultaneously in multiple locations as the barriers between dimensions grew thin. Deeper into the crypt they ventured, past chambers filled with artifacts that predated human civilization. Here were tools and symbols left by previous species that had fallen to the Hollow God's hunger, their entire civilizations consumed and repurposed to serve as stepping stones between the realm of pure negation and worlds that still knew the light of stars. It was in the deepest chamber that Clara finally encountered the 61. They stood in perfect formation around a space so vast that her candle's impossible light could not reach its boundaries. Each figure retained enough of their human appearance to be recognizable, yet they had been transformed into something that existed primarily as vessels for alien consciousness. Their eyes held depths that extended far beyond their physical forms, and when they spoke, their voices created harmonies that seemed to originate from the stone itself rather than their throats. "Welcome, sister," they said in perfect unison, their words carrying the weight of decades of accumulated devotion. "We have been waiting for you to complete our number, to add your voice to the song that will bring our master fully into the world of flesh and time." At the center of their formation stood an altar that defied description in conventional terms. It was carved from a single block of stone so black that it seemed to absorb not just light, but the very concept of illumination itself. Upon its surface lay the implements of sacrifice, blades and bowls and geometric instruments whose purposes Clara understood with the terrible clarity of inherited knowledge. But it was what lay beneath the altar that truly revealed the horror of their situation. Through gaps in the stone floor, Clara could see into chambers that extended downward beyond measurement, filled with a presence so vast and alien that her mind recoiled from direct perception. The hollow god was already here, had always been here, waiting with the patience of geological time for the moment when it could extend its influence beyond this hidden realm. Thomas moved to take his place among the 61, his transformation now complete. As he joined their formation, Clara saw his individual consciousness dissolve and merge with the collective that had consumed all the others. Yet something of his humanity remained, enough to speak her name with what might have been sorrow or gratitude or both. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice now part of the greater harmony that filled the chamber. "There's no more fear, no more uncertainty, no more isolation, only purpose, only belonging, only the eternal song that connects all things in perfect unity." Clara found herself drawn toward the altar, her feet moving without conscious direction as the 61 began to sing. Their voices created frequencies that resonated in her bones, in her blood, in the spaces between her thoughts where individual consciousness flickered like a candle flame in cosmic wind. The song spoke of surrender as the highest wisdom, of dissolution as the path to true understanding. It promised an end to the burden of separate existence, an escape from the prison of individual awareness into something vast and eternal and gloriously empty of all human concerns. As Clara approached the altar, she saw her reflection in its black surface, but the image showed not her current self, but what she was destined to become. The reflection smiled with the same beatific calm that marked all the consumed, its eyes holding depths that extended beyond the boundaries of mortal perception. Yet even as part of her yearned for the peace that surrender would bring, another part recoiled from the altar's promise. In that moment of supreme crisis, Clara faced a choice that would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of countless others who might follow in her footsteps. She could surrender, join the 61, and complete the covenant that would bring the hollow god fully into the world. Or she could fight, resist, and bear the terrible burden of remaining human in a place designed to consume humanity itself. The choice hung before her like a blade poised to fall, while below in the unmeasured depths, something vast and patient stirred with anticipation, waiting to learn whether its long vigil was finally coming to an end. The moment of choice stretched like eternity itself, suspended in the space between heartbeats, while 61 voices held their note in perfect harmony. Clara stood before the altar with her hand extended toward the obsidian blade, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down upon her shoulders like the accumulated prayers of all those who had been consumed by Hollow Creek's insatiable hunger. It was then that Reverend Caro emerged from the shadows beyond the altar, his gaunt frame moving with the fluid grace of something that no longer belonged entirely to the world of flesh. His pale eyes burned with fanatic fire, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to originate from the depths below rather than his throat. At last, he said, his words creating ripples in the air that Clara could see as well as hear. The 62nd offering approaches the altar of transcendence. You have learned well, Miss Whitmore. Your journey from questioning student to willing sacrifice demonstrates the perfect operation of our sacred pedagogy. Clara's hand trembled above the blade as Caro continued his revelation, each word stripping away another layer of illusion about her time at the seminary. Did you believe your selection was random? Did you imagine that your questions, your defiance, your very presence here was anything other than carefully orchestrated theater? You were chosen before your birth, marked by bloodlines that stretch back to the first covenant, prepared through generations of careful breeding to serve as the final key in a lock that has held our master bound for far too long. The headmaster moved closer, and Clara could see that his transformation had progressed far beyond anything she had witnessed in the students. His skin had become translucent to the point where she could observe the alien geometries that had replaced his internal organs, structures that pulsed with rhythms that belonged to no earthly biology. Every headmaster before me was once a student, Caro continued, his confession carrying the weight of terrible pride. Each chose power over release, dominion over dissolution. I was young once, like you, filled with questions and doubt and the arrogant belief that individual consciousness was precious rather than burdensome. But I learned the truth that you now face. There is no freedom in resistance, only in surrender. The 61 began to sing more loudly, their voices creating harmonies that made the chamber itself resonate like a vast musical instrument. Clara could feel the vibrations in her bones, in her blood, in the spaces between her thoughts, where the hollow god's influence had already taken root. But it was Thomas who provided the catalyst for her final decision. As the collective song reached its crescendo, she heard his individual voice rise above the harmony, speaking words that belonged to him alone rather than the consciousness that had consumed him. "Fight," he whispered, his humanity reasserting itself for one crucial moment. "Remember what it means to be yourself, to choose your own path, to refuse the peace of emptiness. Break the pattern, Clara, break the covenant. Make our suffering mean something." The effort of speaking as an individual, rather than as part of the collective, cost him dearly. Clara watched in horror as cracks appeared in his translucent form, spreading outward from his mouth like fractures in glass. But his sacrifice gave her the strength she needed to make her own choice. Instead of grasping the ceremonial blade, Clara seized the candle she had carried into the depths. Its flame, burning with colors that belonged to no earthly spectrum, suddenly blazed brighter as she held it above her head like a torch of defiance. "No," she said, her voice carrying across the vast chamber with surprising strength. "I refuse. I will not be the 62nd offering. I will not complete your covenant. I will not surrender my humanity to feed your emptiness." Caro's expression transformed from triumph to rage, to something approaching fear as Clara brought the impossible flame into contact with the ancient texts that lined the chamber walls. The manuscripts, written in materials that should not burn, erupted into flames that spread with supernatural speed, consuming decades of accumulated knowledge and preparation. "You cannot destroy what has already been completed," Caro shrieked, his voice fracturing into multiple harmonics as his carefully maintained human facade began to collapse. "The covenant exists beyond mere physical form. The hollow god is already—" His words were cut short as the spreading fire reached a collection of scrolls that contained the binding formula that held the hollow god's influence in check. As these crucial texts burned, Clara felt a massive shift in the chamber's atmosphere, as if fundamental laws of physics were being rewritten in real time. The 61 began to scream in unison, their voices rising to frequencies that shattered stone and bent reality around their epicenter. But their screams were not of pain, they were of release, as the destruction of the binding texts finally allowed them to break free from the collective consciousness that had held them prisoner. One by one, Clara watched the consumed students remember their individual names, their separate lives, their unique humanity. The process was agonizing to witness, as decades of accumulated dissolution reversed itself in moments, but it was also beautiful, like watching flowers bloom in fast forward or stars being born from cosmic dust. Thomas was among the first to fully return to himself, his translucent form solidifying as his individual consciousness reasserted control over his physical existence. He staggered toward Clara through the chaos of burning texts and screaming stones, his face wet with tears of joy and terror and overwhelming relief. "The fire," he gasped, pointing toward a section of wall where the flames had revealed hidden passages that led deeper into the earth. "It's not just burning the texts, it's burning through the barriers that hold this place together. We have to get everyone out before the whole structure collapses." But even as they began to gather the newly freed students, Clara realized that their victory was incomplete. The hollow god itself remained in the depths below, and the destruction of the binding texts had not banished it, but merely freed it from the constraints that had limited its influence to the seminary grounds. A sound rose from the unmeasured depths, Not quite music, not quite speech, but something that combined elements of both into a form of communication that bypassed human language entirely. The sound spoke of hunger so vast that galaxies could not satisfy it, of patience so profound that it had watched the birth and death of universes, of a love so alien that it expressed itself through the complete consumption of everything it touched. The hollow god was rising, Clara realized with crystalline terror. Without the covenant to contain it, without the careful rituals to channel its power, it was free to extend its influence beyond the hidden chambers where it had waited for so long. The fire that had freed the 61 had also broken the last chains that bound something that should never have been awakened. As the chamber began to collapse around them, as stone fell like rain and reality itself seemed to fracture at the edges, Clara faced the ultimate consequence of her choice. She had saved the individual souls that had been trapped within Hollow Creek's walls, but in doing so she had unleashed something upon the world that might prove far more terrible than the localized horror of a single seminary's hunger. The last lesson she realized with bitter irony was that some victories carried costs too terrible to calculate, and some choices led only to different forms of damnation. As she led the freed students toward passages that might or might not lead to safety, she could only hope that whatever emerged from the ruins of Hollow Creek Seminary would find a world strong enough to resist its alien hunger. Behind them, in the depths where no light had ever penetrated, the hollow god began to sing its own song of liberation, a melody that would soon echo across valleys and cities and continents, calling to others of its kind who had waited in similar prisons for their own moments of release. The fire that consumed Hollow Creek Seminary burned for 3 days and 3 nights, its flames visible from villages 20 miles away. Yet when the local fire brigade finally arrived to combat the blaze, they found something that defied all explanation. The building had not merely burned, but had somehow folded in upon itself, as if the very space it occupied had collapsed into dimensions that human geometry could not accommodate. Clara emerged from the ruins as the sole survivor, her clothes singed and her hair white despite her 17 years, carrying memories that would haunt her for the remainder of her life. Behind her, the ancient stones continued to smolder with fires that fed on something other than wood or paper, their smoke rising in patterns that formed symbols against the gray December sky. Of the other students, those 61 who had been freed from their collective prison, no trace remained. Clara had led them through passages that seemed to offer escape, but somewhere in the labyrinth beneath the seminary, they had simply vanished. Whether they had found their own way to freedom or been reclaimed by forces beyond human understanding, she would never know. The townsfolk who discovered her wandering the valley road treated her with a mixture of compassion and bewilderment. They spoke of a terrible fire that had consumed an old abandoned building on the hill, a structure that had been empty for as long as anyone could remember. When Clara tried to tell them about the seminary, about Reverend Caro and the students and the horror that had been unfolding within those walls, they looked at her with expressions of genuine confusion. "There's never been a school up there, child," said the village doctor who examined her for injuries. "That building's been a ruin for decades, ever since the old mining operation shut down. You must have been caught in some kind of accident with vagrants or drifters. Sometimes folks shelter in abandoned places and their fires get out of hand." It was then that Clara began to understand the true scope of what had been destroyed. The fire had not merely consumed the physical structure of the seminary, but had somehow erased it from the collective memory of everyone who had not been directly touched by its influence. The carefully maintained illusion that had hidden Hollow Creek's true purpose had become reality in reverse. Now the horror was hidden, and only the illusion remained. She tried showing them the letters her father had received, the acceptance documents that had brought her to the seminary in the first place. But when she reached for the papers she had carried with her since leaving home, she found only blank sheets that crumbled to ash at her touch. Every piece of evidence that Hollow Creek Seminary had ever existed was vanishing, consumed by the same force that was erasing it from human memory. Over the following weeks, as Clara attempted to rebuild some semblance of normal life, she discovered the full extent of the erasure. Parents who had sent their children to the seminary had no memory of doing so. Church officials who had recommended the institution insisted no such place had ever existed. Even the carriage drivers who had transported students to and from the remote valley had no recollection of ever traveling that particular road. Clara alone remained to remember. She became a living repository of memories that the world had rejected, carrying within her consciousness the testimony of 62 lives that history refused to acknowledge. The weight of this burden was almost unbearable, to know that such suffering had occurred, that such evil had been allowed to flourish, and to be unable to convince anyone else that it had ever been real. She tried, at first, to find other survivors. Using what little money she had remaining, she traveled to the addresses she remembered from letters and conversations, seeking the families of her fellow students. But in every case, she found the same deliberate ignorance. Parents who had lost children to Hollow Creek's hunger had somehow convinced themselves that their sons and daughters had died of illness or accident, their memories rewritten to accommodate losses that made sense within the boundaries of normal experience. It was during one of these futile journeys that Clara made a discovery that would define the remainder of her life. In a small town in Vermont, she encountered a woman who had been asking questions very similar to her own questions about missing children, about institutions that existed only in nightmares, about memories that felt too real to be dreams but too impossible to be true. Mrs. Helen Morrison was a thin, nervous woman whose son had vanished 2 years earlier, after being accepted to what she remembered as a prestigious religious academy. Like Clara, she had found that all evidence of the school had disappeared, leaving her with nothing but the certainty that something terrible had happened to her child. "They're everywhere," Mrs. Morrison whispered during their first clandestine meeting. "These places that feed on children, that consume innocence and faith, and turn them into something else entirely. I've found traces of at least a dozen similar institutions across the country. Maybe more. All of them hidden, all of them forgotten, all of them still operating." Clara learned that the Hollow God was not a single entity, but rather part of a vast network of alien consciousnesses that had been infiltrating human civilization for centuries. Each seminary, each hidden academy, each forgotten institution served as a feeding ground for these entities, carefully designed to harvest the spiritual energy of the young and idealistic. The destruction of Hollow Creek had been a victory, but a small one. Even as Clara had broken the covenant that bound one manifestation of the Hollow God, others continued their patient work across the world, gathering their own quotas of 62 souls to fuel rituals that would tear reality apart piece by piece. Mrs. Morrison had dedicated her life to documenting these hidden institutions, tracking their locations and methods, trying to warn parents and authorities despite the supernatural forces that worked to erase all evidence of their existence. It was dangerous work. Several of her fellow researchers had vanished under mysterious circumstances, their own memories apparently consumed by the same forces they sought to expose. Clara joined this informal network of survivors and investigators, using her first-hand experience of the seminary's methods to help others recognize the signs of supernatural predation. They developed codes and signals, ways of communicating their discoveries that could bypass the memory-erasing effects that protected the hidden institutions. But it was lonely work, made more difficult by the knowledge that they were fighting an enemy that existed partially outside normal reality. For every institution they managed to expose or disrupt, others appeared to take their place, hidden behind veils of forgetfulness that made them invisible to conventional investigation. Years passed, Clara aged, but slowly, as if her exposure to the Hollow God's influence had altered her relationship with time itself. She never married, never settled down, never allowed herself the luxury of normal human connections. Her life was spent moving from town to town, following rumors and whispers, trying to stay one step ahead of forces that sought to silence her permanently. On certain nights, when the fog rolled thick across whatever valley she found herself in, Clara could still hear the midnight bell tolling in the distance. It counted not the hours of the living world, but something else entirely. The accumulating weight of souls consumed, the approaching convergence of realities that should never touch, the patient countdown towards something that would make Hollow Creek Seminary's horrors seem like a child's nightmare in comparison. She had saved 61 souls from eternal servitude, but in doing so, she had learned the terrible truth about the world in which she lived. Humanity existed in a universe filled with hungry things that fed on consciousness itself, and most people were protected only by their own ignorance of this fact. Clara's knowledge was both her burden and her purpose, to remember what others forgot, to witness what others could not see, to carry the weight of truths too terrible for the human mind to accept. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between investigations and revelations, Clara wondered whether she had made the right choice that night in the depths below Hollow Creek Seminary. The peace of surrender had been within her grasp, the promise of an end to isolation and fear, and the crushing responsibility of individual consciousness. But then she would remember Thomas's voice cutting through the collective harmony, reminding her what it meant to choose her own path, and she would know that some burdens were worth bearing, some loneliness worth enduring, some truths worth preserving despite their terrible cost. On certain nights, when the fog rises thick and the world grows quiet, she still hears the bell tolling in the distance. It counts not the living, but the forgotten, and Clara wonders, when her own name is finally spoken in that endless tally, when her own memories are at last consumed by the forces she has spent her life fighting, will anyone be left to remember the lessons learned in the darkness beneath Hollow Creek Seminary? The question haunts her still, echoing through valleys wrapped in mist, carried on winds that whisper of hungry things waiting in the spaces between reality. And somewhere in that whispered darkness, the answer waits, patient as stone, inevitable as time, hungry as the void that gave it birth. The bell tolls on, counting down towards something that Clara can only pray she will not live to see. But until that final midnight comes, she continues her work, carrying the weight of impossible memories through a world that has forgotten how to remember its own nightmares. For in the end, someone must witness, someone must remember, someone must carry the burden of truth through the comfortable darkness of willful ignorance, ensuring that the price paid by 62 souls in a valley that no longer exists serves some purpose greater than the hunger of things that should never have been awakened. The seminary is gone, but its lessons remain, written not in stone or paper, but in the scarred consciousness of one who chose to remember rather than surrender, to witness rather than forget, to carry forward the testament of those who gave their voices to an eternal song of warning that echoes still in the spaces between heartbeats, in the moments when reality grows thin and hungry, things press close against the boundaries of the world. Clara Whitmore walks on through mist and memory, the last student of Hollow Creek Seminary, carrying within her consciousness the final lesson that no classroom could ever teach. That some knowledge comes at a price too terrible to calculate, but too important to abandon, no matter how heavy the burden of its truth.